They served in the U.S. House for more than 47 years. So it's a perfect time for a civil dialogue with two former members of the U.S. House. So I want to thank former Congressman Dave Obey, Democrat, represented the 7th District, Northwest Wisconsin, for 42 years, 1969 through 2010, sir. No. And Tom Petri, a Republican, represented the 6th District, Fox Valley area, for 35 years, ending in January when you retired, right, Congressman?
Right.
And so explain your current mission. You're going around, you're stopping wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together to talk about...
Well, we're going wherever we don't get thrown out of. I mean, Tom and I have been friends for quite a while, and we just thought it would be useful in this era of snake pit politics,
yes,
to try simply demonstrate that people can have friendships across the aisle. I mean, you got 2 problems. The first problem is why do the American people have no use for politics today? And on that, I think it's simply because government isn't delivering for regular people what it ought to be delivering, and so people say, why should I pay attention? But then secondly, I think there's a lot of manufactured nastiness as well in politics, and given the seriousness of the problems we have to face, the country simply can't afford that.
And your PS, Tom?
Well, I'd say that politics has always been contentious. And anyone who knows anything about American history or the history of democratically elected institutions anywhere in the world knows that, well, even Abraham Lincoln supposedly jumped out the window of the Illinois legislature when he
to avoid a vote
to deny a quorum to the other side. So people do represent districts and groups with different views and different perspectives and different priorities, and the democratic process is a way of channeling that and hopefully doing it for the good by working out differences or compromises or at least figuring out ways of moving on other areas where people do agree. Well, they downplay the disagreements until they can finally act as a community. So it's very important, and I thought there had been so much emphasis on the nastiness in politics, some of it being personalized, that we ought to give an example of someone. We disagree on a lot of things.
Good.
But almost everyone
let's have a civil dialogue over it.
Even in our family, we disagree from time to time. But I think we agree on a lot of important things as well, and you have to keep things in perspective.
Well, you're both students of history. Which of our founding fathers said, "A democracy if you can keep it"? Who was that? Was that John Adams?
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
How would you respond? How fragile is our democracy right now? Congressman, you want to go first?
I think our democracy is in trouble because we have had this huge increase in the gap in income between poor and the top dogs in society. And I think that creates an unraveling of social fabric that you need to keep the country together. We've got tough problems on taxes, on global warming, on foreign policy, Iran, for instance. Those are tough issues, and it's hard enough to deal with those issues when you have legitimate differences that you're debating. But if the public has no confidence in what the government is doing, and then because they aren't delivering, and then if you also recognize that a lot of this nastiness has been manufactured for the benefit of one group or another, it makes it almost impossible to deal with the problems we have, and that turns the public even more cynical, which is the last thing you can afford in a democracy.
Tom?
Well, I'm actually very optimistic, and I believe our republic is soundly founded, going back to the tradition started by General Washington of civilian rule. Even during the Revolutionary days, he was very, very careful to consult with and to follow the directions of the Continental Congress, and always insisted on civilian rule, and that's part of the built into the fabric of the American military. So I believe as long as the American people want to have a republic, we will have a republic. And we have elections every 2 years. If they're dissatisfied with the people who are there, they have the right and opportunity to get rid of people until they're either satisfied or at least willing to accept what. Sometimes we have to take bitter pills, even as a community, to move forward.
What about Dave's comments on income inequality? Do you see that as a worsening issue?
I think that there's a difference between wants and needs. And the United States is the richest, certainly richest large society in the world by far. I lived in the Peace Corps in Somalia, where the average income was $50 a year, which meant most people weren't even in the money economy, and we're far from that. Obviously, if you have a wealthy country, someone has to have wealth, and if you have a private sector, and the question is whether they're spending it on themselves. Even if they do that, they're going to be hiring a lot of people, but or if they're investing it wisely for the good of the community, and that's been one of the secrets of our system. So I think it'll even out, and in any event, it will benefit the community over time if people make responsible decisions whether they're rich or poor.
Well, former chairman of Ways and Means, do we need some...
Not Ways and Means, appropriations.
Appropriations. I'm sorry, Congressman. Former chairman of Appropriations.
You got to spend it. The other guys got
yeah, that's right. My mistake. Does Congress need to act on this issue of the wide gap in the haves and have-nots?
Well, I certainly think they do. I mean, I think that the difference we have is generational. I think the World War II generation experienced two unifying events, which turned this society from a me society, which it was in the 20s, into a we society at the end of World War II. Those two events were World War II and the Depression. And those experiences taught that generation that everybody was in it together, and the country was going to get ahead if they worked with each other. That generation has now largely, in political terms, died off. And so now I think we have the politics of the country is being led by a generation that has not had those, they haven't experienced those unifying events. Mm-hmm. And I think it makes it easier for people to fall into, this is mine and you worry about yours, I'm not going to. And I just think it comes down in the end to what kind of a society you have a vision for and how you think we will do the best. One example, university. When I first entered the University of Wisconsin as a student, I paid $90 in tuition a semester. The understanding then was that the student and his family would pay for about 20% of the cost of instruction, and the state would pay for 80%. Today it's almost totally flipped the other way because of a succession of decisions through the years. And I think that means that it's harder for people of average means to have their kids get the kind of opportunity that was available to me when I went to college.
Well, just a PS, the Regents have approved a plan. Non-resident undergraduates will be paying $35,000 a year to attend UW-Madison in the 2018-2019 year. That's a long way from your $90.
Well, that's true, but it's also non-resident.
Yes, that's non-resident.
I mean, I'm concerned about both students because I think Wisconsin benefits by having out-of-state students, so people get a rich cultural experience. But I'm primarily interested in, given the taxpayers' concern, I'm primarily interested in what happens to resident students.
Let's talk about the state of your political parties. Tom, you go first. Yours is very interesting. So your party wins Congress, but it's having major problems with the Tea Party in the House, and it can't even fund highways, which is an issue very dear to your hearts, having chaired committees and subcommittees on the issue. So the state of the Republican Party, sir.
Well, the Republican Party is alive and vigorous and full of a vigorous disagreement. They used to always say, I
is that a healthy disagreement?
I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always a weakness that there was contention and disagreement, because they had a kind of a tradition of fighting like cats and dogs, and then after the decisions were made, getting together and licking their wounds and going out and doing battle battle in a general election. And so far, it's shaping up at the presidential level
Yes.
as though there's going to be a rich array of candidates seeking the Republican nomination, and not much, maybe one or two, and then the elephant in the room, Mrs. Clinton.
Who announced yesterday.
And the party, surprisingly, all things considered, has made tremendous gains the last few years in state houses. It used to be they were traditionally maybe a third of the governors. I think now a majority, and a majority of, I think, members in the legislature overall in the United States. And so maybe we have to start worrying about the future of the Democratic Party. If
I'll give Dave a chance, but let's follow up. Let's talk about the GOP candidates for presidency.
Yeah.
Senator Rubio announced today Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, Rand Paul, and a gentleman named Scott Walker are all, and potentially many more. Is that good for your party to have A to Z candidates?
I think it is, because every party is a coalition, and there are a lot of different elements in the party. It's certainly true of the Democratic Party, and it's true in the Republican Party as well. And of course, we have a large and diverse nation, and I think it's a good idea for people who want to provide national leadership to have the opportunity and really the requirement that they go around and visit different parts of the country and try to convince people in Alabama to vote for someone from Wisconsin, for example. And I think it's a healthy process.
Have you endorsed anyone? Probably Governor Walker's would like your support.
He's certainly my favorite son from Wisconsin.
Okay.
I think he has a lot of potential. He's he's provided, whether people agree with it or not, they, I think, will agree that he turned out to be a strong leader, as demonstrated by 3 elections in 4 years, or two elections in 4 years in Wisconsin.
And I imagine you never expect to have to say the words President Walker, do you, Dave?
All I can say is I think it would be a not very healthy thing were he to become president. Not because of him, but because of where he stands on substance. This country has gone through incredibly frustrating gridlock. The politics has been incredibly nasty, and the more House members who get elected to the Senate, the more that nastiness invades the Senate as well as the House. I think what the country needs above all else is a real pro in the White House who understands how to pull disparate groups and disparate peoples together. I don't think that the track record in Wisconsin would indicate that Governor Walker is that person. In fact, just the opposite. I think he has been an incredibly polarizing person, and maybe that is not all to the bad at the state level. But at the federal level, we've got enough trouble now with people interfering in diplomacy, as the famous letter about Iran showed. But I think you need somebody in the White House who is not habitually giving the back of the hand rather than holding your hand out. So I would be very concerned.
Have you got your "I'm ready for Hillary" button in your left or right pocket there, sir?
No, I haven't gotten involved in the campaign. I happen to think quite highly of her, but she just announced yesterday, and there's no point in endorsing if there's only one candidate. So let's see
Should she have a primary challenge, Congressman?
Oh, she will have a primary challenge. I would be amazed. Whether it's a credible primary challenge or not, I don't know, but she will have a primary challenge. And so, I mean, there will be somebody who forces her along the campaign trail to hone her message, and that'll be good for her.
That'll be good for her. Yeah. Talk to me about campaign finance in the wake of Citizens United. That was several years ago, and now some of the things, you gentlemen must just be amazed, having served in Congress for decades, at what's going on and the amount of money that ends up in these third-party groups, and it's not traceable. You want to go first, Dave?
I think it's a terrible problem. When I got elected to the State Assembly, I spent $1,160. Contrast that with what happened to Russ Decker 2 years ago in the State Senate seat around Wausau. He was ahead 10 days before the election. He was ahead by about 7 points in the polls. In the last week, they dumped $500,000 in against him and beat him. And they bragged about publicly about what they'd done. The problem with these court decisions is it means that you never have enough money because somebody can always hit you with $500,000 from out of nowhere. It means that politicians have to spend so much of their time raising funds. One of the main reasons I quit, frankly, is because I didn't want to spend half of my life every day dialing for dollars like a glorified telemarketer. I just didn't want to do that, especially since I was chairman of appropriations.
Yes.
And in that job, your job is to say no 90% of the time. It's pretty hard to do that if you're then going to go to somebody and ask for a campaign contribution. So,
can the Citizens United genie be put back in that bottle, Dave?
I think the only way that I mean, theoretically, with a constitutional amendment, you can do it, but that requires 3/4 of the states. I don't see that happening. The only conceivable way, realistically, that it could happen is if you elect somebody to the White House who, for the next 3 elections, will appoint people who will send the courts, or who will have the court reconsider those decisions.
I see.
If they don't, it simply means that money is going to run the show.
Did campaign finance play a role in your decision to not seek re-election?
Well, not really. When I first ran on a shoestring, and the district that I represent is a little bit like Dave's. Usually did not involve tremendous amounts of money being spent. The 6th district doesn't even have a TV station within it, although obviously stations broadcast and so on.
Right.
There are, I think there's some, I mean, I agree that it's a problem. And the Supreme Court may have been right that people have the right to express themselves and to contribute or spend money to do that. But we do have a problem that the court needs to readdress, I think, and they're starting to do it, and that is this issue of coordination. Mm-hmm. We all know there's sort of a wink and a nod, and it can be explicit or implicit, or the situation can be set up in such a way that there's coordination sort of before, and then these groups are created, and there's just it's pretty clear that there is coordination at some level in both parties and with most of these groups that are involved across the political spectrum. And so I think a lot more thought needs to be given to make sure that what you're doing is not twisting the Constitution to go beyond individuals' rights, and I think there's some possibility there. Secondly, I think it's with the modern internet and all the rest of it, it is possible to get more small contributions to be a counterweight mm-hmm. to the few large people who are down on this.
I'd just like to point out what Bob La Follette said years ago in his own autobiography.
Please.
He described, when he was a student at the university, he described hearing a speech by the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, Ryan. And here is what he said. He will never forget what he said, and this is what the Chief Justice said. He said, "There is looming up a new and dark power, a vast corporate combination of unexampled capital taking the field as an organized power. The question will rise in your day, which shall rule, wealth or man? Which shall lead, money or intellect? Who shall fill public stations, educated and patriotic free men, or the future serfs of corporate capital?" I'd say that pretty well sums it up.
Truer perhaps now than when Justice Ryan said that, Dave?
Well, I don't know if it's truer, because at that time this state was run by the insurance companies, the railroads, and the mining inders and the timber types. And so I don't know that it's worse, but it certainly
I want to come back
is
to
a warning we ought to heed.
I want to come back to a phrase you used earlier. Is it these third-party groups, and we can't trace the money, that are, your term, manufacturing this nastiness, Dave?
Well, I think some politicians are manufacturing nastiness too. But we have the public needs to understand they're part of the problem too. We talk about how the politicians are polarized today. Look at the Pew poll that was done 25 years ago. When they were asked, do you believe that government has an obligation to help those who can't help themselves? 79% of Democrats in society said yes, and 62% of Republicans said yes. 25 years later, that same question was asked. Democratic support came in at 75%, so a loss of 4 points. But Republican support dropped from 62% to 41%. That indicates that the public is every bit as polarized as politicians, and that makes it even more difficult to solve problems because that means there is less and less pressure to compromise. And then when you add to that the huge number of safe legislative seats, both at the congressional and the state level, it means that there is very little pressure on politicians today to compromise. And we need more incentives for politicians to compromise.
The numbers he just gave, a 1/3 drop among Republicans in the role of government. Do you think that's a fair summary of what you saw in your years in Congress, Tom?
I don't know. I do know that negative ads, as Dave said, it's not just the people doing it. The fact is, whether you like it or not, everyone says they hate them. But they do move numbers. Yeah. That's the reason they're doing it. If they move numbers against people running the negative ads, they'd stop running them. And it's been the pattern in Wisconsin and in other states where one candidate or another, particularly for major offices, will try to get out real early and negatively define their opponent. It happened to Mark Green as an example when he was attempting to run for governor some years ago. And then it becomes almost impossible to dig yourself out of that hole
because you've been identified by your opponent early.
Funding in the closing days of the campaign, which is usually not the case.
Let's talk about some issues. You were in the chair when the House passed the Affordable Care Act. Has it worked?
Well, I don't think it's worked as well as it would have if we'd had single payer. But I think, we've got millions of additional people covered by insurance.
The president
today
says he scores it at 16 million. I don't know the number. That's just what I heard.
The numbers bounce around depending upon whose numbers you listen to, whether it's 16 million or even 6 million, and it's certainly above that. That is a net positive for the country. I never want people to go through what I went through with my sister. She was dying of cancer. When I visited her the last time, she said, "Dave, I hope I die by Friday." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because that's when our insurance runs out, and I don't want to leave Jack and the kids with bills." And she died by the next Friday. It is unconscionable that we have allowed for 70 years the debate to go on about whether or not we're going to have universal health care or not. It doesn't mean you're going to have free health care, but you ought to have meaningful access to quality medicine. And that's why after 70 years the Congress finally passed it. And it's got lots of weaknesses because it continued to be based on private insurance as the delivery model. And I'm willing to accept that as long as you deliver the goods to people who need it. But when the Congress passes something like that bases the legislation on private insurance, and then the people who've insisted you do that then attack you for taking their own suggestion, that gets a little screwy in my view.
5 years after the Affordable Care Act, its legacy?
Well, when it was going through, it went through a number of different committees in the House, and then the leadership took the different bills and rewrote it and took it to the floor and so on. When it went through my committee, we did have a Dennis Kucinich, of all people, offered an amendment to provide for single payer on a state option. So we could see if it worked or not, instead of trying to do it for the whole country all at once. And if it worked, great. And I voted for it, and it passed in our committee. But it was taken out by the Democratic Party leadership in this particular case. And I still think it was a missed opportunity. It was supported and opposed by people in both parties. It's one small example of bipartisan Republicans, because they don't like single payer, but they thought, well, something that works, and it starts small and see if it works. If it works better than something else, other states could adopt it, and using the experience in democracy. In Wisconsin, we have a policy of trying with good employers and with state programs through Badger Care and things like that, of having a very high rate of coverage even before the affordable
Second
care.
only in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
When Tommy Thompson was governor, I worked with Tommy. We got seed money put in the budget to help states look at how they could come closer to having all of their people covered. And I called Tommy, and he worked on that with me and supported it. I have to believe that if Tommy had been governor when we passed this package, that you would have had an expansion of Medicaid. You would have had much more greater cooperation. I was on the first, back in the 60s, I was on the task force that created the first Medicaid law in Wisconsin. And at that time, you couldn't tell on that task force who were Republicans and who were Democrats. The Republicans didn't like what had happened at the national level, but they worked to make the thing work. And so you had much more willingness and much more pressure to compromise. Today that's gone, and so we see this polarized situation, unfortunately, with the Medicaid population in this state. And it creates serious budget implications for the state as well as humanitarian problems.
I think we can. I hope we can move beyond, because in our state we've had a tradition. We have pretty much nonprofit hospitals in our state, and then we have Coalition, Aurora, the Marshall Clinic, Gunderson Clinic, all of these, and they have always been a kind of a public-private partnership, because the leading employers in a community often sit on the boards of these hospitals. They're paying many of the bills directly or indirectly. They're very concerned about their employees, as are their employees themselves, obviously, of getting good coverage. And they're also concerned about the cost. And we've been trying to do a lot of innovations at the state level through the different health care providers, and it's been like walking through molasses to get the little waivers and changes at the national level. I don't know if it's because of the insurance lobby or if it's because of bureaucratic problems or what it is, but our state medical society has even supported to have greater transparency of costs, enable people to do best practices, and a lot of things that can be done to improve the delivery system, not just worrying about coverage and insurance, but the delivery system to make it more affordable.
Well, other GOP governors, like Kasich in Ohio, have expanded Medicaid. Do you think Wisconsin should take the federal $300 million and expand it?
I'm not going to.
All right,
I'm not
I understand.
an expert on that.
I understand. How about national security? Is our nation more safe than after 9/11, Tom?
In some sense, I worry, because I think we're seeing a gradual. The psychology of going too far in trying to have perfect security and gradually eroding our freedom is a long-term worry from my point of view.
Okay.
And I think clearly you want to have very strong intelligence and good defense. But this sort of fear and this sacrificing your freedom to allow all this, I think, excessive surveillance and things.
You sound like you're worried about what we learned about the NSA data gathering as a result of Mr. Snowden's.
I really don't, frankly, like all this goofing around at the airports all the time either. The cockpit's hardened. No one's going to be able to get in the cockpit, and we've got two people there all the time, so it's unlikely to have what happened in Europe. And it's really basically not particularly necessary, in my opinion.
Safer?
I'm an outlier on this issue. Most people say that our problems in the Middle East were exacerbated when we had the second Gulf War. I trace it back to the first. Because I think George Bush Sr. did a very good job of pulling people along and explaining why he was doing what he was doing when we went after Saddam in order to free Kuwait. The problem is that afterwards we stayed so long and were so visible in our presence that we became the sitting ducks, just like our soldiers were the sitting ducks in Lebanon years earlier, when they could sit there with their guns, but they weren't chambered. the rounds were chambered.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we allowed our adversaries in that region to call us the problem. We were the great Satan. We were the problem. And that made it easier to recruit extremists. And then the second Iraqi war dispirited the American people, as well as further angered extremists in the Middle East. And I think any time that you're the big guy on the block, whether it's justified or not, sooner or later somebody's going to take a pop at you. And I think that's what's happening now in the Middle East. And we need to find ways to have smaller footprints, be more effective, be more subtle, be more nuanced, and let regional players deal with their own little issues when they get in the way of the broader issues.
Well, and a quick follow-up for both of you is the deal that Secretary Kerry negotiated with Iran in the best interests of our country. You want to go first, Dave?
If you can get the deal, I think it most certainly is. I don't know whether or not in the end the Iranians are actually going to sign on to that deal because they have a strange politics in their country too. But if we could get that deal, it would certainly be in the interests of the United States and the entire world.
Congressman?
And we tend to forget this is a deal between the Iranians and not just the United States, but the Russians, the Chinese, countries. The British, French, and others. Yes. So you have to assume that we tend to personalize it in terms of President Obama, but it's actually an international effort, and the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Chinese and the Israelis have nuclear weapons. If we can keep the Iranians from doing it, reducing the possibility of them getting it, I think it'd be a good thing.
Okay, two final questions. We're almost out of time. Most effective president that you served under, and least effective?
This may surprise a lot of people, including David, but the one that made the biggest impression on me was the first one I served under, and it's equal. I have to say Ronald Reagan obviously is an icon, but Jimmy Carter was a lot more effective than people gave him credit for.
96 through 80, yes. 76 through 80.
There's a leg in American, if you're running, it's like a huge, the country is big, and it takes a long time for the policies to actually be implemented. But Carter, with Paul Volcker, started the breaking the back of inflation. He started the buildup in the military because he tried to cut back, and the Russians thought we were weakening and increased it, and he convinced the Europeans and the United States to increase defense spending by 5% a year in real terms for 10 years to drive the Soviet Union to the ground. And he deregulated the economy with Alfred Kahn and other people. The trucking, banking, railroads, electricity, major sectors of the economy in order to make our country more economically competitive around the world. Those were major policies which from people in both parties don't like to give him credit for, and many of the Republicans give Reagan credit for it. But the things were actually passed in Congress, most of them, before, and the groundwork was laid by Reagan. So I shouldn't say that. It's against my interest.
Surprising vote for Democratic, one-term Democratic president
for one reason or another.
Jimmy Carter.
But anyway.
Dave?
Well, I'll get to Obama in a minute, but first let me simply say that in my book, in case anybody wants to buy it.
What's it called?
In my book, I said that I thought that the most effective president I served under, or the best president I served under, was Jerry Ford. And when I saw Jerry on the House floor about a year afterwards, just before the book came out, I told Jerry that I said, you're going to be shocked to know that I'd ranked you the best president who I worked with. And he leaned forward and he said, slim pickings, wasn't it? But I did that because I thought Ford did a very tough thing that had to be done when he pardoned Richard Nixon. That enabled the country to move on beyond Watergate. Okay. Now,
you promised to get President Obama.
I differed with him at the time I thought what Ford did was wrong, but I was wrong and he was right. With respect to Obama, I would simply say, I don't know yet where I would rank him because his career is not yet done. Okay. But he did save the economy along with the Congress after the collapse. Before he took office, he did manage to get through the health care bill. He is moving on climate change to the extent that he can, and if he can get these deals with Cuba and with Iran, he will have a very impressive record. It would be hard not to rate him up there as the most effective.
Well, because we're almost out of time, my last question is this. You probably have already been asked this. When young people say, I'm thinking about entering politics, what advice do you give them in 2015 with all the manufactured nastiness? Tom?
Well, get a good education. Pay attention to, learn a little bit about history, learn some economics if you can, all the rest of it.
Do you advise them to get into politics, or is it just
I think we all have an obligation, as to the extent we are, to give something back, and you look at Congress, sure, but what about county boards, city councils, school boards, civic associations, church councils? Our country wouldn't work if people at the community level weren't putting an awful lot back in every day, and instead of sitting back and waiting for someone else to do it, because it doesn't really work that way. So you can't. I think it's a person's obviously you have your obligation to get a good education to the extent you can, to get yourself established in some trade or business, and to take care of your family, but you have an obligation to give something back too, whether it's through your church or your community or both, and politics is just one aspect of that.
Thank you. David?
Politics has given this country Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education, environmental protection, and a whole list of other things. For 10 years, I chaired the Foreign Operations Subcommittee. UNICEF people told me that because of the actions of our subcommittee over that 10-year period, we had saved the lives of over 250 million children. That's all worth doing, and it was politics that enabled us to get it done. It was politics that enabled us to deal with the Soviet Union after they collapsed, and helped Eastern Europe to regain economic and political freedom. So to me, next to being a clergyman, politics is a holy, I think it's a holy calling. And there is no way that you can more directly impact your society than to get involved in politics. So I would strongly encourage people to do it if they're motivated for the right reasons.
Gentlemen, thank you. Congressman Tom Petri, Congressman Dave Obey, thanks so much. Good luck as you go around talking about some of the challenges we face, but the wonderful history that much of which you gentlemen witnessed. So thank you so much for stopping at Wisconsin Eye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.